All right, so I had a couple of questions come in about the sound design for Rip It that I posted recently, and figured why not? I can kind of go through the patterns that are built on here and the couple of machines that they're using, and sort of give a little insight into how it's built. It's not crazy as far as the general machines themselves. It's mostly in the way that it's mixed, and the compressor and EQ settings on the master effects. So just to review, this is what it sounds like. Yeah, so that's where we start. Let's go ahead and I guess we'll work. We'll work from kind of the beginning to the end as far as the devices. So the first thing we hear is this guy. And in the description I said I didn't use any samples, and I apologize, that was a lie, because this is actually this is a sample. It's a sample from my Nord drum that I made. It's just it's a pretty simple like white noise with like a square wave sort of ting. It was my take on kind of the Sono EO snare drums that Alessandro Cortini made. And there's just a lot of delay send on it, but that's really the only thing. Delay and a little bit of reverb. But if you take those off, it's kind of a modular sounding snare. But I'm not doing anything crazy with it. Like, I'm not pitching it. It's just straight up 12-bit sample. No filtering, no EQ, none of that stuff. Just the reverb, which is very gated. We'll get into that in a little bit. But gated reverb and a hefty amount of delay. You can hear, like, if I crank it all the way up, like there's a very aggressive, not aggressive, it's just a very, very short delay time. So it's almost like a secondary reverb, like a spring reverb sound almost. So let's reset that. So that's our first sound. That's pretty simple. The next sound you hear in that video is the kick. So we'll go to there. That's going to be pretty easy. So this kick is basically just the TRX BD. Yeah. And if you look on the screen, you can kind of see what's going on. It's tuned pretty low, long decay, sort of a 808-ish ramp. I guess it's actually halfway between an 808 and a 909. It's got like a lot steeper and slower pitch envelope, and then a little bit of start and a little bit of noise. So start is like a tonal attack transient, and then noise is like a white noise attack transient, like a click. And then a lot of harmonic distortion, as well as a lot of regular distortion. But EQ, nothing. Filter, nothing. Sample rate, nothing. No ring modulation or amplitude modulation, I guess is what they call it in the machine drum. Nothing crazy there. And even if we get rid of the you can hear, see how it's like really distorted still? That's actually the compressor. That's compressor distortion on top of it. But it is distorted as well, like distorting it at the machine level and then distorting it inside with the compression later, that the whole mix is getting kind of compressed with and distorted with. So after that, we've got what, hi-hats? Yeah. So let's listen to those. And they're pretty simple. They're actually just using the generic noise machine. The closed hat is just white noise with a lot of filtering, high pass filtered, with a lot of resonance. And I'm also adding amplitude ring modulation there, like 127 and 96. With the decay this short, you can't really tell. There, if we turn this off, yeah, it's not really doing anything. But it was kind of at one point probably doing something, and you turn knobs till it sounds good. Yeah, that's what that is. And then the open hi-hat, very similar. It's obviously got a longer decay, and it's also using that ring mod. It's got some EQ going on to boost low end. That's even being cut off anyway, but it just sort of, it adds to a lack of headroom, so it kind of creates like more of a flat sound. It's not as percussive, it just sounds more washy. And this setting is like at 104 versus 112 on the closed hat, so it's got a little more a little more tone. It's not all high end. And a little bit of sample rate. That darkens it. You could do it on this guy too if you wanted, but I like the closed hi-hat to be, I like the closed hi-hat. Really ticky, really cutty. And then this, I prefer a little more, a little more sizzly. And you can hear I'm parameter locking the open hat on the second and fourth bar. I've just got like a reverb throw on one of the open hats and a pan all the way to the left. Well, not all the way to the left, but kind of, so it kind of swishes across, does a little whoosh. And then the other bar, I do the same thing with the delay, which, as we heard with the Nord-Drum sample, it's like a more of a spring reverb, and it's panned more aggressively, but also the delay isn't as hard of a send. It's like a little quieter, so the fourth bar isn't quite as, you'll hear. It's like a little brrr. It's almost subliminal in the mix, but it's just, it sounds fun. Both the hi-hats have LFOs. On the open hi-hat, it's on the EQ frequency, which creates just slight variations of where that distortion and drive is coming from. And the closed hi-hat, it's on the volume, so that, I'm just dropping 16ths straight across the entire pattern, and and so it helps give you a little, you know, it adds some variation, some dynamics, so it sounds a little more realistic. Well, as realistic as a very, very synthetic drum machine can sound. So that's all of those guys. So our next stop is the snare drum. So let's focus on that guy. It is the physical modeling snare, the PI synth. And a lot of it, like being straight up, is actually the reverb. There's a lot of reverb send on it. If we get rid of the reverb send, it sounds pretty bunk. The other main part of the sound is the ring modulation. It is like a very slow ring mod, so it's like almost like a shitty tremolo, and it just creates that like crackly. If you get rid of that, it actually sounds pretty good. Like it sounds a little more realistic. But it's still, you know, I don't know. It's like running a real snare through a ring mod to make it sound like a fake snare. So it's like a fake snare pretending to be a real snare, trying to sound like a fake snare again. I don't know. It's filtered. You can see there's a lot of filtering going on. It's very bandpass filtered, mainly because there's a lot of, if I get rid of this again, you can hear there's like bass. And you generally don't want bass in your snare because it's gonna just make everything muddy. So putting this, especially with this like low, it sounds kind of like hollow, almost like white noise. So if we reset it and put it back into that reverb, it's just sounds way better. But I mean, that ring mod, you know, it sounds really good without it too, almost better. I don't know. I like the ring. I like the ring mod on it. I think it sounds really good. But yeah, so let's take the ring mod off and you kind of hear what's going on with this. So pitch-wise, it's tuned down, not drastically. The rattle is all the way up. That's like the noise portion, and the decay is pretty long on it. You know, not crazy, but pretty long. If you just take that away, you just get this kind of like thump. And you could take that up longer. Like it's a very short, like the drum body on the physical modeling, the PI snare is really short, no matter what you do. And the hard control, it just sort of like, it's supposed to simulate hitting it in a different spot. I suppose if you were to put that on a, like an LFO, you could create some more variation with like drum rolls and stuff. I just kind of like it where it's at. One more thing while we're looking at this. I have the ring turned up just slightly. The tension sort of controls the pitch of the body when it's resonating, which there's not much of it. but it can change, it'll change sort of the whole sound. This is like the weird thing with the PI drums, is that they're very interactive. All the knobs kind of control a bunch of shit. You can kind of hear like the pitch of the snare rattling is sort of what's the main change. And the ring, I use a little bit of it because without it, it just sounds really dry. But if you do too much of it, it sounds like that shitty Metallica snare from that Saint Anger album or whatever. Yeah, just real bad. But yeah, no distortion, none of that stuff. You know, don't do too much of that stuff. Don't make that last very long. But if you do that, like that kind of realistic sounding snare, and ran it into this kind of gated verb, it would sound pretty good. Yeah, maybe not. Yeah, those settings are better. Yeah, the snare is kind of the hardest thing to get on any drum machine when you're like synthesizing one, especially one that sounds kind of like a sample. And the reverb is sort of the most important part of this whole thing. Like the reverb and that ring modulation is sort of what really sells the fake package. So those are like the four main drums. The very synthy snare, like the modular sounding snare, the fake real snare, the two hi-hats, and the like boomy distorted kick. After that, it's sort of just machines that are only used sparingly, stuff that is used during the different fill patterns. So if we go to pattern 6, we can get to the next device, which is just a EFM bass drum. And it's muted, so that's not going to be heard. Here we go. And you hear that distortion. There's a little bit of saturation going on, but even with that off, it's distortion. That's the compressor. That distortion is from the compressor. So, I like having a little, that saturation is really just kind of making the tail end a little louder. It's not really adding the main like distortion you're hearing. And it's tuned real low, long decay, subtle envelope. It's like very clicky. Oops. Yeah, it's just that like plip, that little plip at the very beginning. No modulation, so it's not actually an FM bass drum, it's just a sine wave. And no feedback, no mod decay. This frequency doesn't matter because this isn't being used at all. I use the EFM bass drum for sub bass and like 808 basses because it can actually get tuned far lower than the sine wave machine. So you could do this sort of sound with the sine wave, but it only goes down to like something like that. It's like it doesn't go as deep. The EFM bass drum can just go like insanely low, and I think they let you do that because they want you to do You know, they want you to do that kind of shit with the FM. But if you just want like super low bass, just use the FM bass drum without any FM modulation, and you can get a really, really deep boomy bass. And so yeah, I use that in a couple of the fill patterns, but specifically this one here, which sounds like this. And you can hear just like between the like those rapid fire kicks and then the sub bass kicks going into that compressor that's just like clipping and distorted. It creates this very cool percussion-y, like blooming distortion that's really fun. So not much to it. I can't show you the trigs. There is something kind of cool going on with the triggers, and that is I'm using slide trigs on the sub bass. So if we go to the first trig, you can see it's actually parameter locked up to 28. And then I have another trigger that's like back to the regular pitch, which is like the default 20 that it's at, so that when the drum actually hits, besides this like attack boom, there's this slower kind of boom that's happening. And so the trigs are like basically regular parameter locked bass hit, and then this trigger is just like whatever step I'm going to put the next sub bass hit on, which would be like step 7, I'll go back to step 6 and parameter lock it this way. And also I'll parameter lock the value of the volume down to 0 so that it sort of silences it. So you can kind of hear it's like the bzzzt, and it like cuts off really quickly. That's just because if you don't do that, if we were to just leave this, if I like undo these, you'll hear what it sounds like. See how it adds like those ba-boom, ba-boom, boom, ba-boom stuff, which you don't want, because the Machinedrum doesn't have trigless locks like the other machines do. So like with the Octatrack or any of the newer machines, you can just put a trigger or a lock on the step sequencer without actually triggering the voice machine. But the Machinedrum is one of their older machines, obviously. I think it's their oldest besides the SID station. So this is like the earliest version of their sequencer. And so it doesn't do that. And they figure it's a drum machine. Why would you want to make something happen that's not, whatever. But the only other thing that's going on there is if I bring the kick drum and everything else back in. You can hear there's like the ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, which is just the normal bass drum, and I'm panning it left and right, left and right, left and right, left and right, over and over again. And all of those are also being a little bit high pass filtered. So taking out the bassiest bass notes of the kick so that it's not competing with the sub bass, which just lets the distortion that happens from the compressor kind of bloom a little easier. It's only blooming where the contour of the sub bass hits. So as the sub bass goes like boom and like fades out, you're getting a like a bloom of like distortion and saturation kind of fizzing together. Trial and error. I don't know if it really makes that big of a difference, but it seems like it logically would make sense that I wouldn't want to hit the compressor like that, so that's how I did it. But yeah, so kick drum and that sub bass, and yeah, trust me, all of the main heavy lifting is the compressor on that. I'll show you that in a second, but let's go to the next fill pattern and look at the other machines we got going on. So what was going on there? Obviously you heard the sub bass got hit again, but there's two other elements to that. One of them's really hard to hear, and then the other one's very easy to hear. So if I mute the really easy to hear one real quick and run it through one more time, I'll let you see if you can tell what's going on. Yeah, so what was that? That was that thing, which is it's an E12, so it's one of the sample, like the internal sample-based machines, and it's the rim shot. Nothing super weird with, it's a little distorted. There's some distortion, like on the edge of saturation and distortion. So it's really just kind of smoothed out rather than actually doing anything crazy with it. The main change here is it's obviously got the retrig turned all the way up so that it'll go. So without it, it's just the more pangy, roomy sounding rim shot. And I'm using a slide trig again. So there's one actual trigger on that is layered on top of where the sub bass hit happens in that last bar, and it's got the pitch detuned, so it's like lower in pitch than it normally is, and I've locked the start position to 0, and then the very last trig, I have it at the end point. So what's cool about that, when you use slide trigs to change the start position while it's retriggering, you get sort of a time stretch, like old Akai sampler sound. Which I just think sounds like really cool. It's got like kind of an Techer, like IDM-y vibe to it. Sounds like you're pitching something. Snare drums, the E12 snare drums, all of the E12 machines have this start retrigger stuff going on with it. So you can do this with any of those, and it's really fun if you have a pattern where there's just like a bunch of hits that are all parameter locked with the retrig on, and you just like start doing like a control all machine or doing the hold function and turn it, and get like weird time stretch, like halftime vibes in the pattern, and then the next pattern has everything locked to being just straight hits again. It can be pretty cool. But yeah, it sounds pretty dope when you layer with that sub bass. I'm also, you see the pitch is locked too, so it's not just like time stretching, it's like time stretching and pitching up, so it's getting this kind of like riser vibe to it. Yeah, but other than that, like nothing with the effects or anything other than some distortion. I don't think, oh, there's a little bit of panning as well, and then of course you know, whenever you're doing slide trigs with the Machinedrum, locking the second trig to 0 so that it doesn't hit another snare that's offbeat. And that's like the second locks are on step 16, so it's going from step 1 to step 16 to slide through the entire bar. And then we've got this last thing, which is a RAM record machine, which you would think the recorder machines wouldn't make sounds, and you would be right, but they can make sounds when you're internally resampling. So if we look at the settings here, it's set up with pretty much the standard main output recording level and the main input A and B recording levels. There's nothing plugged into input A and B. Obviously, this is just recording. This is probably just adding like less headroom or more like line noise to the recording, but whatever. With at 0, it's not actually boosting or cutting. It's just sort of recording directly whatever's coming out. And then you've got these two Q outputs, or not outputs, I should say, Q settings. Q1 is active all the time. So as soon as you create a record machine, a RAM record machine, this lets you hear what's going on in your inputs or your main the whole time, which is good if you're like sampling like a record or a synthesizer. You can, if you want to hear what's coming through the inputs, or if you're just out of machines in your tracks and you just want to like listen to something and you're trying to record the entire mix, you could theoretically get away with like parameter locking the M level to down, or leaving it down and then P locking it up just for certain bits where it's recording or something. I don't know. It'd be sort of janky, but you could work around it. But what we're doing here is actually taking advantage of Q1 and Q2 when you leave M up, because then you're listening to the output going through the recorder, back to the output, back to the recorder, back to the output, back to the recorder, and you're getting feedback, and that's what that is. It's actually the sound of the output going in on itself in a perpetual loop. Q2 is the exact same as Q1, but it only stays open and then it shuts itself back off as soon as the recording length is finished. See, so if we bring this back up, Q1 is just going forever, and Q2 is only available during the time it's actually recording into the buffer. The length setting, I don't know if, I don't want to turn this into a tutorial on how these RAM machines work, but basically the recording length all the way up is 2 bars. So like 64 will record 1 bar, divided in half to 32, and you can record half a bar. It just depends on how much sampling time you need. And like, we're not really even using the sampling for this part just yet. We're really just kind of we're more in it for this feedback effect. And the tone of the feedback changes drastically based on the effects, because that's the other cool thing, is that since you're getting a feedback loop, you're getting the output run through all of these effects in parallel with itself. So sample rate reduction, filter resonance, the bandpass filters, the EQ, the ring modulation, the distortion. Obviously, I have the distortion cranked. I have it going through the reverb so that it's, then the reverb is in a feedback loop. And so you can use all sorts of stuff. The delay, you can use it as a, if you send the feedback through the delay, you hear it's like winding down a little bit. Yeah, it's hard. That's a very, the delay I have set up, not like a regular delay anyway. But if you get rid of these, it sounds really bad. And it can sound even worse. Here, I'll kill your ears. Yeah, it sounds awful normally. So you have to really dial it in. Part of it is setting your filter. If you let too much low end in, watch what happens. Well, actually, that sounds kind of cool. But normally, like especially if you've got the sub bass hitting at the same time, actually, that sounds cool too. It's all about experimentation, honestly. But making sure that none of that low end gets through makes it, it like blooms feedback rather than being obsessed with all this low end stuff. Yeah, I'm trying to make it sound bad, but I got it kind of dialed in. Here, if we go into this and then yeah, sorry. Yeah, so that's kind of that guy. It's really, really fun. I use it all the time in some of my live sets. I do some sets where it's just the Machinedrum and a Pro 2, which a Pro 2 also, they have feedback. Dave Smith does tune feedback in some of his synths. The Pro 3, I think, also has it. The Pro 2 has it. The old Evolver had it. It's like a really cool technique. Like feedback loops on digital synthesizers is something you don't really expect to have, and it can create very interesting effects. So I like using it a lot. That's kind of like my main, I don't know, secret weapon, if you want to call it that, with the Machinedrum. So now everyone knows how to do it. Cool. And then the last machine is just a sample buffer that is the same. This is recording one, this is playback one. So when you make you get So there's a little bit of retrig on it. It's pitched up. The start and end points are pretty close to each other, you know, like very, very close. So it's a short sample. The bit rate's turned all the way up. Samples playback speed's pretty quick. It's filtered to get rid of all that extra low end, because if it ends up jumping to a spot where, like, you know, the kick drum was being recorded at the same time, I don't want that muddy low end. So I'm kind of taking the low end out and then taking some of the highs out so that the hi-hats can still sort of be like the top end of the track. And yeah, it's going through the reverb so that it gets that cool gated, because without it, it's kind of cool. It'd be cool if it was like really rapid fire and you had like a more house, I don't know, like a weird kind of glitchy house track. That could be cool. But putting it through that gated reverb, I think that's where it's at. And then the LFO for this is just updating the start. So sometimes it's behind and it's like a little bit of reverse when it gets done repeating. Sometimes it's like closer. Sometimes it's starting from the very beginning. And the very beginning is where like the bloom happens. So you hear like sometimes it's more of a oh instead of like the squeal. Yeah, and it allows me to like throw a couple of trigs on it, and then this just, if I let that pattern play, it'll just keep going. You know, that kind of thing. And then that's it. That's all the machines. That's how it's set up. So real quick, let's go over the effects settings, which are kind of the bread and butter for this. So a trick I picked up from Max Marco is that I have the gain on the EQ turned down, which kind of like gives you some of your headroom back. You know, the machine drum can get really loud. I actually have my master volume at like, I don't know, like 7 o'clock. So like just above the bottom. Actually, I guess it's probably more like 9 or 10 o'clock right now. But yeah, you know, below 12 on the dial, it's like pointed right about here, instead of, you know, normally you try and set your volume in the middle so you have room to go forward or backwards. I have it like turned down to here and it's still plenty loud, and I have the gain turned down. A little bit of a smile EQ, like some high pass, or a high shelf I should say, and a little bit of low shelf with the low frequency emphasis kind of turned down a little bit. High frequencies kind of boosting more into the 3K, like more of the harsh frequencies. And the peak filter is actually doing a little bit of gain. If I turn it up, you can see where it's at. It's like right in here. We're like in this. So it's just giving a little bit of boost to like the snares, pretty much. Oops, sorry. Q factor is like not super high. It's kind of a wide filter. Yeah, I don't know. That's like, you know, that's only going to be applicable for this pattern. Like I wouldn't use the same EQ settings over and over, but just the thought process was to like kind of crisp up everything, since I knew it was going to get destroyed by the compressor, like pull some mids and then yeah, then use the compressor to destroy it and add like a bunch of, like a lot of mid-range saturation was going to come back. And the reverb is pretty simple. You know, there's some pre-delay, long decay, a little bit of dampening, like not a ton, 16. Most of the reverb sculpting is done by the high pass and low pass filter. So it's like making sure not a lot of low end comes in. Even though the snares are pretty filtered already, they're not very dark. This helps with the feedback, right? We let that in. It's not drastically different, but when you start letting it go, like when I do at the end of the song where I turn up Q1 so that it's monitoring all the time, you don't want low frequency accumulation in your reverb. It just makes it sing a little easier. But then also heavy gate, if you got rid of the gate, yeah, I mean the Machinedrum's reverb doesn't sound that good comparatively. It's got a kind of lo-fi character, so like if you want like big you know, like techno rumble reverbs or anything like that, you can get there. I've gotten some like okay results, some usable results out of it, but I think it's better for these, you know, that kind of stuff. It's cool that the gate, like when it reopens, like, so this thing, if it was still going, you see here, like, you can hear some of the remnants of the other drums happening when things come through it again. Because obviously the decay is pretty long. I think that's kind of fun. It kind of creates these like glitchy ghost notes in the track, which is kind of why I parameter lock those reverb throws on the open hi-hat to like kind of add a little hit of reverb you weren't expecting when it's not either of those two happening. I have the volume turned all the way up on both the delay and the reverb so that they kind of are more present, because I'm not using them a ton, so I can kind of afford to be really heavy-handed with them. The echo time is at 4, so real short. There's a little bit of modulation, very, very subtle, because a little goes a long way with this. That's not what I meant to hit. That's what I meant to hit. You can kind of hear it, like, even with the mod at like 6, it's already kind of seasick. Like, it's almost impossible to use this as like a nice, normal, like modulated delay. I don't know why anyone would ever like even if you go up to here. You know, it's just like so obnoxious. It's like spanning almost the entire range of the delay, and you're like not even at 50%. Although that sounds actually kind of cool, but yeah, I don't know how you'd ever use that regularly. That's like, I guess the cool thing about the Machinedrum and the mono machine is that there's no sweet spots. It's all open to you for the most part. You can just kind of do whatever the hell you want and hope for the best. But yeah, so last thing, let's wrap this up before we get to an hour while talking about this, is the compressor, which is where like all the magic's happening. So the compressor on the the Machinedrum is very difficult if you're used to, say, the Digitact or the Octatrack or the Analog Rhythm, any of the other machines that have compressors. The settings on this are not backwards, but kind of backwards. So the mix knob, you need to think of it as like the dry mix. So all the way down is compressor only. And then you're bringing in parallel dry processing. So with 127, it's also going to be very quiet. But yeah, no compressor. And then down is like full compressor. So I have it at like 110, I think. 100 actually. So, you know, almost all dry. But if you look at the settings, like they make no sense. I've got a very slow attack, a somewhat quick release, middle of the road threshold, so it's like just solidly kind of compressing all the time. The knee is really dropped down so that it's like very squishy. High pass turned all the way off so that I think, I'd have to like check the manual again, I think this is letting the low end through so that like bass frequencies can hit the compressor as well. It's so hard to tell, especially when you're like playing a very busy pattern and everything. Compression ratio is pretty high, so it's like squishing and ducking pretty aggressively, which you can't really hear because it's very, very low in the mix, but that's because the gain is almost all the way up, like 115, which if you've ever tried to use this as a regular compressor, or like the Rhythm can do this too. You can actually get this kind of distortion in the Analog Rhythm, even though you have a master output distortion with that asymmetrical setting, which is really cool. Plus all the analog distortions on each channel. You can still like use the compressor as a distortion module if you wanted to, you know, just crank the gain, do everything nuts, and then slowly bring it back into the mix. And then your mix knob sort of becomes your distortion, like gain control, which is how I'm using it. So just to kind of finish it out, I guess I'll show you like what happens with these like terrible compression settings, and move it back through. There we go, that's the knob I want. So we'll start with no compression, and then we'll like go all the way into balls out, like sound terrible, and then dial it back, and you can kind of see where you can like mix between squishy distortion and full-blown fuzz and like a little bit of like only when the pattern's really going crazy, which is kind of where I sort of settled on it, which is, you know, so when the sub bass fill with the like panning kicks and stuff happens, it like really crunches up, but otherwise sounds like, yeah, it sounds distorted, but everything just sounds also really glued, and it sounds like a heavily processed track, but it's still very transient because the mix is very low. Yeah, let's mess around with it. About here, like right here, that's like Ansem territory. So I'll listen to it without. It sounds so bad. Sorry, I didn't mean to blow up your spot there. So yeah, all right, cool. 56 minutes, under an hour, covered everything on it. Hopefully this was useful, I hope. I don't know, it's really fun. It's a fun collection of patterns. I really like the feedback stuff, especially the feedback with the ring modulation. That's a fun trick. And I can create all sorts of different sounds. Yeah, so have fun with it. I'll probably do a better recording of this and put it out on a release. I do some techno stuff under the name Modern Devotion. And yeah, this will probably be one of those tracks. I'm also, I do a bunch of other stuff, but yeah, so we'll see. I'll probably work on this some more and do some more stuff with it, and hopefully y'all got something out of it. Peace.